Okay, let's actually adjust a reed. So we're going to use the wires for this adjustment, but before we do any bending of any kind, it's a good idea to know what we're going for. So just like before we adjust a reed, it's so important to assess what the problems are. We also want a positive picture of what we want our reed to do when we're done adjusting it. So here are some of the goals you should be paying attention to. One is that the reed has a good response, and that means in both registers, high and low. A crow, then, the reason a crow is considered to be good if it has a mix of high and low sounds is because both registers are responding. Okay, so we can expect that our low notes will come out and our high notes will come out. If a reed is stiff, it's doing a great job vibrating at a high frequency, and then as soon as we try to play low, it's hard to get those reeds vibrating at the frequency that we need. At the same time, if we just have a real flatty sound when we're playing on the reed, then our low notes will probably come out, although they might be a little flat, and our high notes are going to be even more flat than they usually are because those reeds are not really prepared to handle the speed of vibration that we need. They don't have the strength to sustain that frequency. Okay, so we want a reed that responds in both high and low registers. Test the high register by trying to play flick key notes with no flick key, and then just test some of those low register notes by playing low using some of the low thumb keys. So another goal for your bassoon reed is that it's balanced, and a really, really good bassoon reed is balanced, and some of the best bassoon reeds would be balanced within thousandths of an inch of thickness. So, I mean, you and I are probably not going to be nailing that on our adjustments exactly, even when we get to cane adjusting. But with enough time and really careful practice, you can definitely help a reed with its balance. And balance basically means that it's the same in all places. It's pretty symmetrical where it needs to be. So think of balance as if I do something to the reed over here, I need to do the same thing to the reed over here, assuming that I'm starting with it balanced. If I do something to shave off a portion of the reed, which is going to be the next segment, adjusting the cane, if I shave off a portion at all, unless the reed was clearly imbalanced, maybe by holding it up to the light, unless it was clearly imbalanced to start with, I need to make sure I do that not only on both of these sides, but once I've taken one reed and adjusted it, then I need to flip it over and do the same things on the other side of that reed. So a great reed is balanced. So we have response and balance, and then we want to pay attention to shape. The quickest way to check on shape is to check that tip opening, the very front of the reed that has sort of that nice, slim, tapered opening. If it looks round, big and open like football, that's way too open, and there's way too much volume of air inside that reed. If it's pinched down because our player has been biting, and it's just trained the cane to pinch down, then there's not enough volume of air inside that reed. So that brings us to the actual sort of scientific variables that we're messing with here. And it's pretty light science, so don't stress. The first one would be volume, like I was just talking about. So when we're actually making these adjustments on the reed, especially with the wires, what we're messing with is volume of air. First of all, so if we open up the tip and we make that reed more open, what have we done to the volume of air inside? We've increased it, right? So with more volume of air inside the reed, the pitch actually gets lower. So as we increase volume, the pitch gets lower. And the same thing is true if we close down the tip of the reed and we decrease the volume of air inside the reed, then the pitch of the reed goes up. The other variable, that was volume, the other variable that we mess with is vibrancy. Okay, and that has a lot to do with our adjustments of the actual cane when we change the thicknesses of the reeds. So vibrancy is how easy it is to get one of those reeds to be set into vibration. As vibrancy increases, that means it's easier to get the reed to vibrate, pitch gets lower. So if my reed is a little bit softer or a little bit flatter, the vibrancy is higher. It's easier to get it to vibrate, and that causes a lower pitch. At the same time, decreasing vibrancy, making it harder for that reed to vibrate, raises the pitch. So a decrease in vibrancy raises the pitch. Finally, when you put a reed in your mouth to play, you get an effect that's called damping. Basically, you put these big slabs of lip on top of the cane and you've dampened the vibration just a little bit. And damping lowers vibrancy. Damping makes it harder for those reeds to vibrate. That makes sense, right? We put our lips on there and it's harder for those reeds to vibrate. So the act of actually playing the reed always raises the pitch just a little bit. So that's the damping effect. But the two variables that we're messing with reed adjustments are volume and vibrancy. Now you actually adjust both the volume and the vibrancy when we make adjustments to the reed. And I'll go over briefly the effects of adjusting the wires on the reed, which is what we're doing next. But they're also written down for you in the workbook. So let's try it out. We're going to adjust the wires on this reed a little bit to see what happens at the tip. Okay, so the tools we're going to need to adjust the wires on our reed are pliers and something like this called a mandrel. We're going to give the reed a little bit of support and strength by putting it on here, and that way when we use the pliers to bend these wires, the cane is not the only thing supporting that squeeze. We're going to prevent our reed from cracking, or at least do the best that we can. What you should not try to do is put the reed onto the bocal and try to adjust the wires there. Most of the time the bocal isn't even that far into your reed, so you're really doing it without anything in there. But it's a big, big problem if you accidentally squeeze down somewhere too close to your bocal and you dent that or close that off. Now your bocal, which is a pretty spendy item, is basically unusable until it gets fixed. So don't do this kind of adjusting on the bocal. You need a mandrel, or you just have to be really, really careful. So with the reed on the mandrel, I'm going to start by adjusting the first wire. The first wire is closest to the lay of the reed. And in my opinion, it has the most intuitive, or it makes the most sense. When we squeeze it one way or the other, it does kind of what you would expect to the tip opening over here. So if I squeeze at the sides here, what do you think is going to happen? What happens is squeezing in from the sides actually opens up that tip a little bit. We're making this collar a little bit rounder, and that's causing a little bit rounder and wider tip opening. So here's where we're starting. And now I'm going to squeeze that from the side. By the way, I just pulled this reed out of the water, and anytime you make an adjustment, you want to make sure that that reed is thoroughly soaked. If you try this on a dry reed, you're going to crack it immediately. So it's kind of tricky the first time you do this to get a sense of how much you need to squeeze, but you'll feel the wire give just a little bit. Just don't go crazy and overdo it, but it will be noticeable when it moves. So now I've given that wire a good squeeze, and I can look at the end, and I can see, sure enough, it's definitely more open than it was before. So I've increased the volume of this reed. Now both wire adjustments that I know how to do with I can make two adjustments on the first wire, and I can make two different adjustments on the second wire. And that's the difference between squeezing on the sides, like I just did, and squeezing on the top. So the effect of those adjustments is always either opening or closing the tip. I just opened the tip, which typically gives it a little bit more full, dark tone, and it lowers the pitch slightly. But it does create a little bit of a harder response. Now, I'll reverse the effect And this is one of the best things about adjusting the wires. This is a real safe way to try to help your bassoon player with their reeds without doing anything too drastic, like getting out a knife and accidentally slicing off a corner of the reed. The best thing about reed wires is that they can be put back. They can be squeezed from the side and the top, and the side and the top, and you can always go back and just undo what you just tried. So I'm going to squeeze them from the top and the bottom here at the first wire to close that tip opening again. And now I look and see, again, it's about back to where we started. I've closed that tip opening down just a little bit. Now, I said that the first wire kind of makes the most sense because of the way it rounds the tube and opens the tip, and then it sort of smashes the tube and closes the tip. All you need to remember about the second wire is that it adjusts in the opposite way. So, squeezing from the top, instead of closing the tip, I open the tip of the reed a little bit. Some people emphasize that the type of opening that the second wire helps with is sort of like a roundness. You can experiment with this on your own to see what you think. So giving that a little bit of a squeeze, I can see that I've opened my tip just a little bit. You may also notice that there's a slight more roundness, or I've actually changed the shape of the tip slightly by adjusting the second the second wire. Okay, and then I can reverse my change by squeezing that reed from that wire from the sides. So what does this do? It's the opposite of the front wire. And if I squeeze this from the sides, what's going to happen? It's going to close that tip opening again. So I've given it a little squeeze. I look at the front, and sure enough, I've closed that tip just a little bit. Now I hope that you can see the differences. It's not a hugely dramatic visual change, open and closed, but even those small adjustments in the tip opening of the reed can make a big difference for response. It can also help a lot with balance, and it's a big deal to establish the correct shape for a bassoon reed. Make sure you study some diagrams of proper tip openings and do a little experimenting on a reed that you're not too worried about. This reed started to develop a little bit of a crack here, which is probably one of the reasons that it's not in use right now. But you can see if I hold it up closely, there's a small crack that's begun right here in the collar, right in the center of the reed. And that reed could easily split a lot further up if I adjusted this, number one, without soaking it, and number two, if I just squeezed it too much, that crack could travel the rest of the way up into the reed. So you want to keep an eye that you're not generating a crack or doing anything too dramatic. I noticed that I did cause just a little bit of slippage. So if I look on this side, you can see those sides have gotten a little bit uneven. So I'm going to need to go back and, working with this wire right here, reshape it by sort of squeezing top and bottom and side to side. Or I need to reshape this side so that these rails go a little bit more flush again. Okay? That's why you want to practice on a reed that's not, your bassoonist's concert reed for tomorrow, but practice on either a bassoonist's old reeds or on some broken reed that a student brought to you after it got chipped. Okay, so those are the basics on adjusting the wires.